is disobedience. Period. If God says, I want you to do it right now, He does not mean tomorrow. He does not mean 10 minutes from now. He does not mean 30 seconds from now. If He says, I want you to do something right now, to delay it at all is disobedience. We're going to study one of these tough guys in here that had to learn this the hard way. Now, Naaman, he was a heathen from Syria. Now, Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. So Naaman was a mighty man and honorable. Honorable in the Bible generally means he was a man of much importance. Not, we think of honorable as doing honorable things, and then, yes, it means that also. But in this particular instance, and in many, when it's talking about honorable, it's talking about a person of honor in their country, in this case in Syria, in the army. He was probably the general. And he didn't get there by being a nice guy. There were no go to ROTC in college and come out, as a second lieutenant or whatever they do. No, there was none of that. Back then, you had to get to be the general by going through blood, period. You had to prove yourself, because them guys were not, it's like the Marines. The Army guys say, go get them. The Marines say, follow me. And they're right out in front, and they do. They say, follow me. They're trained. They got to lead the charge. That's the way Naaman was. He was the one that led the charge. Every time there was a battle and he was there, he was the man that was out in front, and he would tell them, follow me. And he was also probably a very rich man, because most soldiers back then didn't get paid. If they did, it wasn't very much. But when they took over a city, then the soldiers just pillaged the city, and whatever they could find belonged to them. But the general got the first pick. So he was probably a very rich man, a man of quite a bit of importance, and a mighty man of valor. And God used him to give deliverance unto Syria. But one of the problems Naaman had, I guess this is the night for swords, one of the problems Naaman had was when he earned his way to being the general of the army, he did it with a sword and with his own arm. He would be the kind of man that if there were 15 people coming at him and 500 more around there, and he had 5 guys, it'd be like the Marines. You ask 5 Marines, you got 500 people coming at you, shooting, what do? Charge and kill them all. That's just the way they're trained. And that's the way Naaman was. Everything he got by himself with his own arm. He was the kind of guy, when they were coming at him, he'd take his sword and he'd just wade into it. And a sword like this doesn't weigh as much as the swords they had then, but even this sword right here, and it's not sharp. I don't sharpen it because kids always want to touch it. But I'll tell you what, if I give a two-handed swing with this and hit you in the arm, it's either going to cut your arm half off, but for sure it's going to break the bone.
Yeah.
Just simply for the weight and the kinetic energy of that thing moving at probably 100 miles an hour when it hits that little tiny spot. Martial arts, that's why in Ken Po we use those 2 knuckles as the leading knuckles. That way, because all of your strength goes into those 2 leading knuckles. Strength all the way, we teach from the hip. That you strike from the hip. Well, it's the same way with the blade. That's why that edge is so small. Because when you swing this at somebody, and it hits them with that little tiny edge, all of the power of the arm and the swing, and I bet you Naaman wasn't no little tiny dude either. I bet he was pretty big for whatever the size the Syrians were. He was probably one of them that was like Saul in the army of the Lord. Saul was head and shoulders above the rest of them. Isn't it funny how when Israel won the king, they picked the biggest guy they could find? And God says, well, that's fine. I'll give you a king, and I'll even give you Saul if you want him. But he's going to take your finest men to put in the army. He's going to take your finest horses. And he's going to make you support him, and that's exactly what he did. And so Israel picked the biggest guy they could find to be their king, and who did God pick? A little ruddy-faced little boy that was out tending sheep. It was a musician. He must have been effeminate. No, he was just a musician. We know that musicians don't have to be effeminate, but back 100 years ago, if you were a musician, they figured you just really didn't want a real job. that's partially true, too. Now that I think about that one, I better shut up. But Naaman got everything he had by the strength of his own arm and the swing of his sword. And so that's what this sword represents in this story. The story of Naaman is self. This is self. When Naaman wanted money, he went out, they attacked the city, and by himself he got everything he wanted. If anybody got in his way, he didn't tell him to get out of the way, he just cut it in half. And they'd be out of the way. Mm-hmm. If he wanted your wife and you didn't want him to have your wife, he'd give you a short haircut right about to there. Take your wife. Everything he got by himself. Nothing else. Didn't have to have anybody else help him. He was a mighty man of valor. I got to get back where I was. Mighty man of valor. Tough guy. Did everything he wanted, got it himself, but he was a leper. Now, in the Hebrew, the word leper here is sa'ah. And from it is a derivative of Miriam had leprosy, right? That's sa'arat. Sa'arat. And it's not, leprosy is the closest we could come in the English language. But really, sa'arat, leprosy is only in the skin. It's in people. And you might get it in an animal, but generally it's in people. But remember, the leprosy in the Bible, it would infect the walls of houses. It would infect the clothes and everything else. Now, yes, we understand that the disease that they used to call leprosy could be carried in the clothes, but the Bible disease, Za'arat, would actually infect the clothes. And it would grow in them, and if the clothes would just fall apart. You had to burn the house out, because if it got in the walls, you couldn't get it out. And leprosy that we know, mentions, I can't remember the name of it, a disease that they call, name they have for it now. But it's only people. That's all. And so what this guy had was a leprosy-like disease. It was like leprosy. Then in a human, it looks just like leprosy. The only difference is it turns the skin white. They'll have patches. I've got pictures. I did the thing on Miriam, the women of the Bible, and the night we did the one on Miriam and Za'arat. I had pictures of people with leprosy in that, and then pictures of people with a disease, and there's about 8 or 10 of them that fall into that category. That actually they get, if these were black people in Africa, they actually had big white splotches. Big white splotches here where they get that disease, and the skin would turn white, and then it would start to die. And that's what this guy had. See, in Israel, he would have been put out of the camp. I mean, you were not allowed in when you have Za'arat, or as we call it, leprosy-like disease. You were put out of the camp, and that was it. You couldn't come back in. And if somebody came around, you had to take your cloak and put it up over your nose, and you had to say, unclean, unclean, unclean. But see, in Syria, that didn't make any difference. This guy was general in the army. And I'll tell you what, when this guy's there with that sword about that big, and probably a good-sized guy, are you going to walk up and tell him, you're ugly, you got a disease? I don't think you're going to do that. I think he'd do pretty much what he wanted. And it was just not a stigma in Syria like it was in Israel. So this guy's a tough guy, and rich, honorable, a man of high esteem and honor in his own country, and even a servant of God. God used him to give delivery to Syria, one of the enemies of Israel. But God will use anybody he wants to use, any way he wants to use, any time he wants to use them. They can resist, but they don't have a right to tell him, don't let my wife die of cancer.